When whispers threaten to destroy, can love withstand the fire? Grace opened her flower shop, Flora, every morning before the town fully woke up. The bell above the door gave a soft sound, almost like a whisper, as if even the shop itself tried not to disturb the peace inside. The air was always thick with the scent of roses, lilies, damp soil, and freshly cut stems. Every surface carried traces of life. Petals on the wooden counter, water droplets on glass vases, green leaves carefully arranged in ceramic jars. Grace moved through it all with quiet precision, trimming stems, adjusting bouquets, and checking each flower as if it had its own fragile story that needed attention. Her world was built from softness, color, and controlled beauty. People in the town often said stepping into Flora felt like stepping out of reality and into something slower, calmer, almost protected from time itself. Just across the narrow street stood a completely different world. Thomas's forge did not whisper. It roared in silence broken only by the sound of metal meeting metal. The building was heavy, dark, and practical, its walls marked by heat and years of labor. Inside, fire lived constantly in the furnace, glowing orange and white, shaping iron into tools, horseshoes, hinges, and custom pieces requested by the town. Thomas worked with steady hands, his movements efficient and exact, his attention locked on whatever he was forging. Sweat, soot, and sparks defined his environment. There was no decoration, no softness, only function and strength. Where grace created beauty meant to fade slowly, Thomas created durability meant to resist time. The contrast between Flora and the forge was so strong that visitors often paused in the street without realizing it, as if their senses were trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. One side smelled of flowers and water. The other smelled of iron and fire. One side invited quiet reflection. The other demanded focus and endurance. Yet both businesses had existed side by side for years, forming an unspoken balance in the town's rhythm. Grace and Thomas knew of each other long before they ever spoke properly. They saw each other through windows, across the street, in passing moments when one closed a door and the other opened it. Their interactions were limited to brief acknowledgments, small nods, quick greetings, nothing more. "Good morning," Grace would sometimes say when their paths crossed early in the day. Thomas would respond with a short "morning," his voice low and controlled, before returning to his work or continuing down the street. These exchanges lasted only seconds, yet they repeated often enough to become part of their routine, like background noise that slowly becomes familiar. Despite the lack of real conversation, there was an unspoken awareness between them. Grace noticed the way Thomas always arrived early, even before the forge fully heated, as if he preferred silence before the world demanded his attention. She noticed how he never rushed, even when the work was intense, and how his presence seemed grounded, like something heavy that could not be easily moved. Thomas, in turn, noticed Grace's consistency. She never arrived late, never appeared distracted. She treated every flower as if it mattered, even when no customers were present. There was a quiet discipline in her movements that he recognized without needing to name it. The town itself was small enough that their lives overlapped in subtle ways. Deliveries passed through the same streets, customers visited both shops, and seasons affected both businesses differently but equally. In spring, Grace's shop became overwhelming with color, while Thomas's forge received more repair work for tools and garden equipment. In winter, Flora became quieter, more introspective, while the forge intensified its activity, repairing broken mechanisms and reinforcing structures against cold weather. Yet despite these shared cycles, Grace and Thomas remained separate. Their worlds touched only at the edges. Sometimes Grace would glance out the window and see Thomas standing near the forge entrance, arms crossed, observing the street as if assessing its condition. Sometimes Thomas would see Grace arranging flowers outside the shop in early sunlight, her attention fully absorbed in arranging colors into balance. Neither interrupted the other. Neither attempted to cross the invisible boundary that naturally formed between them. Still, something subtle existed beneath this distance. It was not attraction yet, not even understanding, but awareness. The kind that forms when two consistent patterns exist too close to ignore each other. Grace began to notice that her attention occasionally drifted toward the forge during quieter moments. Thomas, without intending to, sometimes paused longer than necessary when passing Flora, as if registering details he did not consciously choose to remember. The town did not comment on this. There was nothing obvious to comment on. It was simply two neighboring lives moving in parallel, one shaped by softness and decay, the other by heat and permanence. Yet in the repetition of days, in the exchange of brief greetings, and in the silent observation across the street, something was slowly forming between them. Not a connection yet, but the early structure of one, still invisible, still unspoken, still waiting for the first real interruption to break the pattern. The rhythm between Flora and the forge remained unchanged until the morning Thomas walked into Grace's shop for the first time with a clear purpose. The bell above the door rang, and the sound felt different from usual customers, heavier, more deliberate. Grace looked up from behind the counter, slightly surprised, because Thomas rarely entered her space. He usually stayed on the other side of the street, in heat and metal, not among flowers. Thomas stopped near the entrance, his presence filling the narrow aisle between arranged bouquets. He looked slightly out of place, still carrying traces of soot on his hands and a faint metallic scent on his clothes. "I need flowers," he said simply, as if the task itself was unfamiliar in his mouth. "For my daughter. School event." Grace didn't react immediately. She simply nodded once, professional instinct taking over. "Do you know what she likes?" she asked, already moving toward the shelves. Her voice was calm, not curious in a personal way, just focused on the task. "Not really," Thomas admitted after a short pause. "Something appropriate." The word made Grace glance at him briefly. Appropriate was not a word she associated with children, but she didn't comment. Instead, she began selecting flowers with careful attention, soft colors, stable shapes, nothing too fragile. Her movements were precise, almost instinctive, as she combined tones of white, pale pink, and light violet into a small arrangement meant to feel warm without being overwhelming. Thomas watched quietly. He did not interrupt, but his eyes followed her hands, noticing how she handled each stem with controlled gentleness, as if she was negotiating with something alive rather than decorating it. There was a kind of respect in his silence, though he would not have described it that way. When she finally placed the small bouquet on the counter, she said, "This should be suitable. Simple, but still expressive." Thomas nodded once. "Good. All right," Grace said, the word barely more than a breath. Thomas didn't wait for a formal invitation. He simply stepped toward the door, his eyes already tracing the uneven line of the frame. He had brought tools instead of raw iron, his movements efficient and automatic as he began tightening and reinforcing the old hinge. Grace watched him for a moment before turning back to her counter, her hands instinctively reaching for a nearby vase of tulips to adjust their height. For a while, the only sounds were the soft, wet snip of her floral shears and the rhythmic, metallic clinking of his tools against the iron. Two different rhythms, existing in the same room without conflict. When Thomas finished, he tested the door once. It opened and closed smoothly, without the previous hesitation. He stepped back slightly. "Done." Grace approached, touching the edge of the door carefully, confirming the fix. "Thank you," she said, more quietly than before. Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth he brought with him. "It's better like this." Grace looked at him. "You fix things often?" "Things that need fixing," he answered simply. Another pause followed, but this one felt different. Less like distance, more like recognition forming without permission. Grace leaned lightly against the counter. "You're not very talkative, are you?" Thomas glanced at her briefly. "No." That was the end of his explanation. But instead of closing the moment, Grace continued. "Most people who work with their hands usually talk more about what they do." "I don't need to talk about it," Thomas said. "That's interesting," she replied. He didn't ask why. Instead, Grace looked down at the repaired hinge, then back at him. "You said something earlier about fixing things. Do you think everything can be fixed?" Thomas hesitated for the first time. Not long, but noticeable. "No," he said finally. "But some things should be tried." The answer stayed in the air longer than expected. Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply looked at him with a new kind of attention. Not curiosity about the task anymore, but about the person standing in front of her. Outside, the street continued as usual. The forge burned. The flowers waited. The town moved on without noticing that something small had shifted between two neighboring worlds. After that day, something subtle changed in the rhythm between Flora and the forge. Nothing visible to the town, nothing spoken aloud, but a shift that existed in the pauses between actions. Thomas did not become a frequent visitor, but when he passed by, his steps slowed slightly. Grace did not search for him, but her attention occasionally drifted toward the forge window more often than before. Their next real interaction happened by coincidence, or at least it appeared that way. Thomas arrived early one morning while Grace was placing fresh flowers outside the shop. The air was cool, slightly misty, and the street was still quiet. He stopped without speaking for a moment, watching her adjust a small arrangement near the entrance. "You always start this early?" Thomas asked. Grace looked up briefly, not surprised anymore by his presence. "Flowers don't wait for people to wake up." He nodded once, as if accepting the logic without debate. There was a pause, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of pause that begins to feel familiar rather than uncertain. Thomas stepped slightly closer to the shop entrance. "Do you ever leave this place?" Grace smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but it always needs attention when I'm gone." "That sounds like the forge," he said. Grace glanced toward his direction. "Except your place doesn't smell like roses." "True," Thomas replied. "It doesn't smell like anything soft." That small exchange was enough to continue without effort. From that point, conversations between them began to appear more often, still brief, still restrained, but no longer accidental. Days later, Thomas returned again, this time not for repairs or flowers, but simply because he had been passing by and stopped. He stood inside Flora longer than before, observing the way Grace rearranged a display of seasonal bouquets. "You adjust them a lot," he said. "They change," Grace replied. "So I adjust." Thomas studied the flowers. "They look fine already." Grace shook her head slightly. "Fine isn't the same as right." That sentence stayed with him longer than expected. Over time, these small exchanges built a pattern. Not emotional declarations, not confessions, but presence. Thomas began to bring small pieces of metal work to show Grace. Simple objects like repaired tools or decorative iron hooks he made during slow hours. Grace, in return, occasionally set aside flowers for him without being asked, small arrangements that ended up near the forge entrance. One afternoon, Thomas finally invited her inside the forge. It wasn't planned as an invitation at first. She simply stood at the entrance longer than usual, watching the fire. "It's louder than I expected," she said. "It's always like this," Thomas replied. "I thought it would feel more dangerous," she admitted. "It is," he said honestly, "if you don't know what you're doing." Grace stepped inside anyway. The heat was immediate. The sound was constant. But instead of stepping back, she observed carefully, studying the rhythm of Thomas's movements as he worked. He did not slow down for her presence, but he adjusted subtly, ensuring she stayed at a safe distance without ever telling her to move. "You control it," Grace said after a while. "No," Thomas replied. "I contain it." That distinction mattered, though neither of them explained why. As the days continued, Thomas began speaking more about his daughter. Not in detail, but enough for Grace to understand that the child was central to his life. "She likes bright colors," he said once. Grace nodded. "Then she probably chose the right father." Thomas didn't respond immediately. "I don't know if I'm the right anything." "You showed up," Grace said. "That matters more than being right." He didn't argue. Later, Thomas brought his daughter to the edge of the town park, and Grace happened to be nearby delivering flowers to a small event setup. The girl noticed the flowers first, then Grace. There was no hesitation in her curiosity. She approached immediately, asking questions about colors and shapes, touching petals carefully. Grace answered each question with patience, not treating her differently than an adult, but adjusting her tone naturally. Thomas watched from a short distance. For the first time, his expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with work or control. After that day, the connection between Grace and the child formed quickly, without resistance. And through that connection, Thomas and Grace found themselves in closer proximity without forcing it. They began meeting in small, unplanned ways, walking the same street after closing hours, sharing simple meals in quiet places, standing near the park without speaking for long stretches. These moments were not defined as dates, yet they carried a similar weight. One evening, Thomas said quietly, "This feels unfamiliar." Grace looked at him. "Because it doesn't have a function?" "Maybe," he said. "Not everything has to," she replied. Thomas didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. And in that silence, something between them continued forming. Not fast, not loud, but steady enough to exist without permission from either of them. The first sign that something outside their quiet rhythm had changed was not obvious. It was a name spoken once in passing at the edge of town, then repeated with slight hesitation, like people were unsure whether it should still matter. Elin returned. She arrived without announcement, as if the town was simply expected to accept her presence again. There was no visible effort to explain her absence, no apology, only a controlled confidence that suggested she believed nothing had truly moved forward without her. Thomas saw her first near the courthouse steps. She stood perfectly composed, dressed in a way that did not belong to the town's slow simplicity. Everything about her posture was deliberate, upright, elegant, controlled. When she turned her head and saw him, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition, as if she had already prepared for this moment long before it happened. "Thomas," she said calmly. He stopped walking. His face did not change much, but something in his posture tightened. "Elin." That was all at first. No greeting beyond names. She studied him briefly. "You look the same." "You don't," Thomas replied. A faint smile appeared, but it did not reach her eyes. People rarely do. The conversation ended there, but the impact of it did not. Grace learned about Elin later that day, indirectly. A customer mentioned it while arranging flowers at the counter, speaking carefully, as if testing whether Grace already knew. "His former wife is back," the woman said. "I thought you should know." Grace did not react immediately. She simply continued wrapping stems. "I see." But her hand slowed slightly. That evening, Grace saw Elin for the first time in person. She entered Flora like any other customer. The bell rang softly, and Elin stepped inside with calm familiarity, as if she already understood the space without needing to observe it. She looked around briefly. "Beautiful shop," she said. "Thank you," Grace replied. Elin's eyes settled on her. Not scanning, not wandering, focused. "You must be Grace." It was not a question. "Yes," Grace said. A pause followed. Elin moved closer to the counter, examining a bouquet without touching it. "You work with flowers. That must be peaceful." "It is," Grace replied. Elin nodded slightly. "Peace is rare these days." The tone was polite, controlled, almost warm. But underneath it was something measured, like each word was chosen for a purpose that was not visible yet. Over the next days, Elin began appearing more often in town. Sometimes near the forge, sometimes near Flora, sometimes simply observing from a distance that looked casual but never accidental. She did not approach Thomas directly again, not immediately. Instead, she allowed her presence to spread slowly, like pressure building without visible force. Grace noticed small changes first. Conversations with regular customers became shorter. Some avoided eye contact. Others became overly polite in a way that felt rehearsed. Nothing was said directly, but the atmosphere shifted. Grace found herself second-guessing her own memory of their quiet mornings. Earlier that day, a longtime customer had pointedly asked if Thomas ever lost his temper near the shop, her eyes darting toward the forge with a mixture of pity and fear. The seed of unease had been planted, making the air in Flora feel thinner, as if the walls were no longer thick enough to keep the town's whispers out. Then Elin returned to Flora a second time. This time, she came alone again, choosing a quieter hour. She looked at Grace with the same calm expression. "You spend a lot of time here," she said. "It's my work," Grace replied. "Of course," Elin said softly. "Work is important, especially when it keeps you close to people you care about." The sentence was light, almost meaningless on the surface, but it lingered. Grace met her gaze. "What do you mean?" Elin tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to answer honestly or not. "Nothing specific," she said. "Just observation." A pause. Then she added, gently, "Thomas has always been difficult when it comes to responsibility. Some people find that out too late." Grace's expression did not change immediately, but something inside her attention sharpened. "I don't know him as you did," Grace said carefully. Elin smiled faintly. "No, I imagine you don't." And with that, she left the shop as calmly as she had entered. Nothing had been openly attacked. Nothing was proven, but something had been planted. Later that night, Thomas noticed Grace was quieter than usual when they met briefly near the forge. She stood by the entrance longer than normal, watching the fire without speaking. "What is it?" he asked finally. Grace hesitated. Someone told me about Elin. Thomas's expression hardened slightly, but his voice stayed controlled. She's back. Yes, Grace said. A pause stretched between them. She said things, Grace added. Thomas looked away for a moment, as if choosing how much of the past to bring into the present. Elin says things when it benefits her. That's not an answer, Grace replied. He looked at her again. It's the only one I have. The fire behind him crackled louder for a moment, filling the silence that followed. And for the first time since they met, something between Grace and Thomas did not feel stable. It felt exposed to something neither of them had invited in. Elin did not rush her influence. She understood timing better than force. Instead of confronting Thomas or Grace directly again, she began working through distance, repetition, and perception. The town itself became her instrument, not through open statements, but through carefully placed suggestions that grew louder each time they were repeated. The erosion of their standing didn't require a campaign. It only required a shift in the town's common vocabulary. Elin began appearing at the local bakery and the post office, never complaining, always offering a tired, brave smile that suggested she was protecting a secret for the sake of the community. When a customer in Flora mentioned Thomas's temper, Elin didn't agree. She simply looked down and changed the subject, a silence that confirmed more than any accusation could. She moved through the social spaces like a gardener tending to weeds, subtly pulling at the roots of Grace's reputation by mentioning how vulnerable people become when they are too isolated in their work. The gossip didn't travel in straight lines. It moved through the grocery store aisles and the church pews, arriving back at the forge as a coldness that Thomas couldn't hammer away. By the time the rumors reached their peak, the origin was forgotten, leaving only the residue of doubt. Grace began to notice something worse than accusation, doubt forming without evidence. At the same time, Thomas received official notices, legal documents, requests for re-evaluation of custody arrangements for his daughter. Nothing final, but structured enough to demand attention. Each document referenced concerns raised by family members, without specifying details. When Grace saw him reading one of the letters near the forge entrance, she understood the situation had moved beyond words. She's using the system, Thomas said quietly. Grace looked at him. For what purpose? Control, he replied. A pause. And it will keep escalating, he added. The fire cracked again, louder this time. Grace stood still, absorbing the weight of what was unfolding. The distance between them, which had once been filled with quiet understanding, now carried interference, voices that did not belong to either of them, but were starting to shape how they saw each other. And Elin, without ever standing between them directly, had already changed the space they stood in. The town changed its behavior before anyone admitted it had changed at all. It began in small refusals, delayed greetings, shortened conversations, and eyes that no longer lingered the way they used to. Grace noticed it first in Flora, where regular customers started choosing their words more carefully, as if they were avoiding invisible traps. Some stopped coming entirely. Others came, but their tone shifted, polite, distant, controlled. The same people who once lingered to talk about flowers now paid quickly and left without looking around the shop. Grace did not confront it. She simply observed it, adjusting her routine as needed, continuing her work as if nothing had changed, even when everything clearly had. Across the street, Thomas experienced the same shift in a different form. Orders at the forge became less frequent, then more selective. People still needed his work, but they interacted with him less than before, keeping conversations strictly functional. There was no open hostility, only separation. The silence between him and the town grew heavier. Elin remained present in that silence without ever dominating it directly. She did not need to. Her influence now existed in the repetition of uncertainty. Every conversation about Thomas carried a shadow of doubt. Every mention of Grace carried a question that no one asked out loud. Then the legal pressure intensified. Thomas received formal notification regarding custody review proceedings for his daughter. The language was precise, structured, and neutral on the surface, but its implication was not. It referenced environmental stability concerns and recent behavioral reports from community members. There were no direct accusations, only collected impressions. When Thomas read the document, he did not react immediately. He stood inside the forge, holding the paper with soot-covered hands, while the furnace burned behind him. The contrast between physical certainty and social instability was sharp enough to feel unreal. Later that day, he showed it to Grace. She read it slowly, carefully, without skipping lines. When she finished, she placed it back on the counter. "This is organized," she said quietly. "Yes," Thomas replied. Grace looked at him. "She's not just talking anymore." "No," he said. "She's building a case." A pause. "And the town is helping without realizing it," Grace added. Thomas did not deny it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The forge continued its steady rhythm. Flora remained quiet across the street, closed for the evening, but still carrying the scent of flowers that no longer felt fully separate from the outside pressure. Grace broke the silence first. "They've started avoiding me." Thomas looked at her. "Me too." Another pause. "This isn't random," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's coordinated perception." Grace studied him. "Why now?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "Because she knows we're connected." That sentence changed the air between them. Grace looked away briefly, processing it. "So this is about us too." "It was always about control," Thomas said. "We're just part of the structure she's trying to rebuild." Grace nodded slightly, but there was tension in her expression now. Not fear, but pressure building without direction. That evening, she walked through the town alone. She noticed how people avoided direct eye contact, how conversations stopped when she passed, how the space around her seemed slightly emptied, not physically, but socially. She stopped near the park before returning home. The place where she had once seen Thomas with his daughter now felt distant, almost disconnected from the present. When Thomas found her there later, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside her at a respectful distance. "They're isolating us," Grace said finally. "Yes," Thomas replied. A pause. Grace looked at him. "And if this continues?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was already unfolding. Then he said quietly, "Then we either break under it, or we prove it wrong." The words were not dramatic. They were factual, and for the first time, the situation no longer felt like background pressure. It felt like a system closing in. The turning point did not arrive as a conversation. It arrived as an incident that looked ordinary from the outside, but was carefully constructed in every detail. It happened near the edge of town, close to the small playground where Thomas's daughter sometimes stayed after school. Grace had been passing by with a delivery of wrapped flowers for a local event when she saw Thomas already there, speaking with his daughter. The scene should have been calm, familiar, normal, but Elin was there too. She stood at a distance that made her presence seem accidental. Her posture was relaxed, her attention divided just enough to avoid suspicion. Yet nothing about her positioning was random. She was close enough to observe everything, and distant enough to deny involvement. The moment unfolded quickly. Thomas bent down to adjust his daughter's backpack strap. The child stepped slightly away, distracted for a second by something on the ground. In that brief gap, Elin moved closer, not directly entering the interaction, but shifting the physical context just enough to change perception. A small object, Thomas's daughter's water bottle, rolled near a step. It tilted, then fell, spilling water across the ground. The child slipped slightly, not falling completely, but enough to create sudden tension and alarm. Thomas reacted instantly. He grabbed his daughter, steadying her before she could hit the ground. His movement was fast, controlled, but sharp. Grace saw it from a few meters away. Elin had stepped into her path just seconds before, pointing toward a rare wildflower near the curb to ensure Grace's head was turned at the precise moment of the noise. When Grace looked, the physical obstruction of Elin's shoulder and the suddenness of the movement created a fragmented, jarring image. It looked like a sudden, forceful movement without context. Thomas was already steadying the girl, his grip firm on her shoulders to prevent a hard fall against the stone steps. The child began crying, startled more than hurt. Elin didn't rush forward. She stayed exactly where she was, forming a visual barrier between Grace and the full mechanical truth of the slip. "It happened so fast," she whispered, her voice reaching Grace just as the visual confusion peaked. "I was surprised he reacted with such force." The sentence acted as a filter. Grace stood still, processing overlapping versions of the same moment. One based on what she saw through the gap Elin provided. One based on what she knew of Thomas. One shaped by the verbal suggestion that had filled the silence before she could think. and none of them aligned cleanly anymore. Later that evening, Thomas found her near Flora, which was already closed. She was standing outside, not working, just present, as if waiting for something she couldn't define. She was there, Grace said before he could speak. I know, Thomas replied. Grace looked at him directly. And I saw what happened. Thomas didn't interrupt. I saw you grab her, Grace continued. It looked aggressive. Thomas took a sharp breath, his jaw tightening as he looked at his soot-stained hands. It was fast. She slipped. I caught her before the stone could break her skin. Grace didn't look away, but her fingers gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. That's not the story the street is telling, Thomas. Then Thomas said quietly, do you trust what you saw, or what she wants you to think you saw? The question landed without aggression, but with weight. Grace did not answer immediately. That hesitation itself was new. Earlier, she would have responded based on instinct. Now there was conflict between instinct and accumulated doubt. I don't know anymore, she admitted finally. That was the break. Not anger. Not accusation. Uncertainty. Thomas's expression tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition of what had been achieved against them. She is shaping perception, he said. Grace looked away briefly. Or I am missing something. Thomas stepped slightly closer, but still kept distance. You're not missing reality. You're being guided away from it. Grace looked at him again, but her certainty was no longer intact. I need time, she said quietly. Thomas nodded once. Take it. But the way he said it was not acceptance. It was restraint. As Grace walked away, the space between them felt different. Not broken completely, but destabilized. Elin had not needed to prove anything. She only needed to create a moment where truth could no longer stand alone without interpretation. And that was enough to fracture trust that had not yet fully formed, but had already begun to matter. The days after the incident did not return to normal. They shifted into something colder, more procedural, as if every interaction now carried invisible weight. Grace did not avoid Thomas, but she also did not approach him with the same ease as before. The pause between them had become permanent until something stronger replaced it. Thomas noticed it immediately, not in what she said, but in what she no longer said. At Flora, she worked with precision, but without the small, unconscious openness she once had when speaking to him. At the forge, when she passed by, she no longer lingered. Everything between them had become filtered through hesitation. And Elin did not increase pressure. She did not need to. She had already achieved the separation she wanted to test. The legal situation escalated again. Thomas received confirmation that custody review proceedings were now active. Meetings were scheduled. Statements were being collected. Community reports were being formally included in the case file. Nothing was final yet, but the direction was clear. That evening, Thomas met Grace near the boundary between their two spaces, halfway between Flora and the forge. He did not wait for her to speak first this time. This will continue, he said. Grace nodded slightly. I know. A pause. Thomas studied her carefully. You've been distancing yourself. Grace did not deny it immediately. I needed to understand what I saw. And he asked. She hesitated. That's the problem, Grace said finally. I don't trust what I see anymore without context. Thomas exhaled slowly. Not frustration, but containment again. That is exactly what she wanted. Grace looked at him. Or what I discovered. The tension between them did not rise. It stabilized into something heavier. Thomas spoke more carefully now. You think I would hurt my daughter? Grace responded immediately. I don't think that. But her silence after the sentence contradicted its clarity. Thomas noticed it. A pause. Then he said quietly, Then you think I might be someone who is capable of what she claims. Grace did not answer. That was enough. He nodded once, as if confirming a conclusion he did not want to reach. I understand. He turned slightly as if to leave, but stopped. I won't defend myself with anger, he said. That is exactly the environment she wants. Grace looked at him. Then what will you do? Thomas met her gaze. I will prove it. Not to you. To reality. That sentence shifted something again, but differently than before. It was no longer emotional defense. It was structural intent. Later that night, Grace could not stay inside Flora. She went through records, conversations, small fragments of memory that had been planted in her over time. She began isolating what she had directly seen versus what she had been told. The pattern was uncomfortable. Most of the uncertainty she felt did not come from her own observations. It came from repetition. Meanwhile, Thomas met with a lawyer in a small office near the edge of town. He did not exaggerate, did not dramatize. He presented facts, timelines, inconsistencies in reports, and the context of Elon's return. The lawyer listened carefully, then said one thing that mattered more than anything else. This isn't about behavior. It's about narrative control. Thomas already knew that. But as the lawyer laid out the timeline, the gap between the incident and the first legal filing, nearly 4 months of silence, revealed a strategy of waiting for the town's gossip to ripen before striking. The paperwork for the custody review hadn't been filed after a crisis. It had been filed after the narrative of instability had been sufficiently repeated in the local markets. "We aren't fighting a moment in time," the lawyer said, tapping the documents. "We are fighting a calendar of rumors." Thomas leaned back, the weight of the months pressing against him. The precision of the timing was the final proof of Elon's patient architecture. At the same time, Grace made a decision. She began speaking to people directly, not to defend Thomas, not to attack Elon, but to verify what had actually been said. She asked simple questions. What did you see? When did you hear it? From whom did you hear it first? The answers were inconsistent, often secondhand, often unclear, often traced back indirectly to the same origin of influence. Elon. By the time Grace realized the structure of it, she no longer saw a series of accusations. She saw a system. That night, she returned to the forge. Thomas was still there. She did not hesitate this time. "I understand what she's doing," Grace said. Thomas looked at her, but did not interrupt. "She didn't just accuse you," Grace continued. "She shaped how people repeat what they think they saw." A pause. "I was part of that," she added quietly. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "She needed one thing more than accusation." Grace looked at him. "Separation," he finished. Silence. For the first time in days, the distance between them was not emotional drift. It was recognition of manipulation. Grace stepped closer. "What do we do now?" Thomas looked at her steadily. "We stop reacting, and we start exposing structure." A pause. Grace nodded once. "Then I will stand in court." Thomas watched her for a moment, as if confirming whether the decision was stable. "Even if the town turns fully against you," he said. Grace didn't look away. It already started. That was the moment something shifted again, not toward trust restored yet, but toward alignment. And this time, it was deliberate. The courtroom was not large, but it felt compressed, as if the walls themselves were shaped by expectation rather than architecture. Every seat carried quiet tension. People from the town were present, some avoiding eye contact, others watching too closely, as if trying to confirm what they had already been told to believe. Thomas stood calmly, hands steady, expression controlled. Grace sat slightly behind and to the side, not as a passive observer anymore, but as someone who had chosen to be present in full awareness of what it meant. Elon arrived last. She did not hurry. She never did. Her presence shifted the room immediately, not through force, but through recognition. People adjusted posture, attention shifted, silence tightened. The proceedings began with structured formality. Reports were read. Statements were summarized. Community observations were presented as neutral documentation, stripped of emotional origin, but not of influence. Then Elin spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. "I never wanted this to become a conflict," she said. "My only concern has always been stability for my daughter." She paused slightly, just enough to let the words settle. "Thomas has always been intense under pressure. That is not necessarily a flaw, but it becomes a risk when a child is involved." She did not accuse directly. She described. She framed. That was her strength. The room listened. Then Thomas spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt emotional persuasion. "This case is built on perception," he said, "not on direct incidents." A slight movement in the room. He continued. "There is no evidence of harm. There are interpretations of movement, repeated without context, amplified through repetition." He paused. This did not begin with truth. It began with narrative placement. The lawyer beside him added structured clarification, highlighting inconsistencies, timing of reports, and indirect sources of claims. Then Grace stood. The room shifted slightly at that moment, not because she was expected, but because she was not originally part of the formal structure of the case in the same way. "I was not involved in the beginning," she said. Her voice was steady, but not detached. I observed him from outside influence. I was uncertain after what I saw. A pause. But I traced what shaped that uncertainty. She looked briefly toward Elin, and it did not originate from direct experience. It originated from repetition of suggestion. Murmurs began, small but noticeable. Grace continued. I didn't come here to offer my own impressions, she said, her voice carrying a new, grounded authority. I brought the people who were directly reached. She stepped back as the lawyer called forward the clerk from the post office and a regular customer from Flora, the same individuals Elin had used as her primary messengers. Under oath, their discomfort was visible, but the pattern was undeniable. They testified not to Thomas's behavior, but to the specific, leading questions Elin had asked them and the concerns she had whispered under the guise of friendship. It wasn't that we saw him lose control, the clerk admitted, looking at the floor. It was that Mrs. Elin kept asking if we had noticed him struggling. After the third time, we started looking for things that weren't there. The room became still. Elin's strategy of using the town as a proxy was stripped of its anonymity. It wasn't just Grace's word anymore. She had spent days connecting Thomas's lawyer with those who had been most affected by Elin's whispers. Under the cold, fluorescent lights of the courtroom, the mechanics of the lie were finally disassembled. The witnesses didn't testify to Thomas's character, but to the specific, leading questions Elin had used to prime their expectations. The room became still. Elin did not react immediately. That silence mattered more than defense. The judge requested clarification. Grace provided it. Calmly, factually, without emotion replacing structure. Thomas did not look at Grace during this moment. He did not interrupt. He simply listened, as if confirming that reality was finally being described without distortion. Then Elin spoke again, still calm. I find it interesting, she said softly, how easily perception becomes accusation when aligned correctly. A faint smile appeared. But perception is still not proof. Grace responded immediately. No, she said. But manipulation leaves patterns. A pause. And patterns can be traced. That was the shift. Not emotional victory. Structural exposure. The documentation was reviewed again. The timing inconsistencies. The indirect sourcing. The absence of direct evidence. The escalation patterns linked to external influence rather than observed behavior. The courtroom atmosphere changed gradually. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Elin remained composed, but for the first time, her silence was no longer strategic. It was defensive. When the session ended, no immediate dramatic ruling was announced, but the direction had changed. The case could no longer rely solely on constructed perception. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Not resolved, but cleared of something artificial. Thomas stood for a moment without speaking. Grace stood beside him. Neither immediately celebrated, because nothing had fully ended yet. But the structure that had been closing around them had finally been exposed to light. And that changed everything that came next. The weeks after the court hearing did not feel like a victory. They felt like aftershock. The town did not suddenly change its opinion, but the certainty that had once surrounded it began to dissolve slowly, like something that could no longer hold its own shape. The custody review did not end in a dramatic reversal, but in a decisive shift of perspective. The final report from the court-appointed specialist was the turning point. Thomas's daughter, usually a quiet observer in the background, had finally been given a space to speak. She hadn't spoken of fear or intensity. She had told the counselor about the flowers Grace gave her, and how her father always made sure the fire in the forge was safe for watching. More importantly, she described her confusion at her mother's return, how Elin had told her to stay away from the forge because it was dangerous now. The specialist's conclusion was clear. The only instability in the child's life had been the sudden, forced introduction of doubt by the returning parent. The narrative of the unstable father collapsed against the simple, consistent reality of the daughter's trust. Elin did not disappear immediately. She simply lost her structural advantage. Without repetition, without indirect validation, her influence stopped expanding. What remained was only direct interaction with reality, something she could no longer control through distance. Thomas returned to his forge the next morning as if nothing had changed physically, but something internal had shifted. He worked in silence, but it was no longer the silence of pressure. It was the silence of stability. Grace opened Flora at the same time. The smell of flowers returned to its original meaning. not as fragile symbols under threat, but as living things that continued regardless of external distortion. Their interactions did not immediately become what they were before. They did not return to the earlier uncertainty, nor did they jump into resolution. Instead, they moved carefully, without forcing restoration. One afternoon, Thomas stood outside Flora longer than usual. Grace noticed him, but did not rush. He entered only when he decided to, not because of habit, but because presence no longer felt risky. "You're busy," he said. "I always am," Grace replied. A pause followed, but it was different now. Not tense, not uncertain, just present. Thomas looked around the shop. "It feels quieter now." "It is quieter," Grace said. Another pause. Then Thomas added, "Not because nothing is happening, because nothing is being added to it." Grace understood what he meant. The town had not become different overnight, but the distortion had been removed. What remained was slower, clearer, more real. Later, they walked together near the edge of town. The same paths that once felt divided now felt simply shared. No declarations were made. No definitions forced. At one point, Thomas spoke quietly. "She tried to separate everything into roles," he said. Grace nodded. "Yes." "She failed," he added. Grace looked at him briefly. "Because it was never that simple." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "No, because it was built on repetition, not truth." They continued walking. The forge still existed. Flora still existed. The town still existed with all its ordinary patterns. But the invisible pressure that once shaped perception had loosened. And in that space, something quieter formed. Not an ending, not a perfect resolution, but a foundation that no longer depended on distortion to exist. And for the first time, that was enough. As they turned to head back toward their respective shops, Thomas reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of scrap iron. He had polished it until it caught the fading sunlight like a mirror, its edges smoothed into the shape of a single, unyielding petal. He handed it to her without a word. Grace took it, her thumb tracing the cool, permanent surface of the metal, and for the first time, the scent of the lilies and the heat of the forge felt like parts of the same world.